Alright, this is study 8 of our study in the letter to the Galatians. Today we're going to be starting chapter 3, which means we're going to begin the theological argument, chapter 3 to 4. Before we do, we'll answer the questions from chapter 2, verse 15 to 21. I just want to say well done to everybody. I know this is a challenging passage, and I had lots of great feedback and lots of great answers given. You put a lot of work into this section, this study 7, so great job on that. Now, it's important to stress that Peter wasn't preaching that Gentiles should keep the law, but his actions in Antioch were demonstrating that he believed the same thing as the Judaizers, who actually did believe that you needed to keep the law and be circumcised. Now, this would have been very confusing to the Gentile Christians, who would have started to believe that they needed to keep the Jewish dietary requirements and be circumcised in order to be more complete Christians. So to stress, it wasn't his preaching, it was his actions that was leading towards this idea and this confusion. So the first question was about how Jews were declared righteous. The Jews could not be declared righteous before God by having the law or by keeping the law. The only way they could be declared righteous before God was the same way as the Gentiles, and that is by faith in Jesus Christ. And Peter knew this. Peter wasn't being taught anything new here by Paul. He knew that. Question 2, what does it mean about Peter having lived this life for so long and now going back towards building the law through his actions? Well, since Peter had been living with and as a Gentile for around 2 decades now, and was now beginning to separate from the uncircumcised Gentile believers, he was by his actions rebuilding the law. Now, this would mean a few things about his life for the last 20 years. It would mean that Jesus was the minister of sin, since it was Jesus that led Peter into this way of life. It would mean that Peter was a lawless rebel for the last 20 years, since he'd been living as a Gentile and not as a Jew. And it would mean that if someone could be declared righteous by the law, Peter certainly couldn't be, because he'd been living in rebellion against it for the last 20 years. So that's all it means in this section. Then we look at question 3, which is about what happened to Paul. Now, the law could only condemn people to death because no one can keep it perfectly. The law is good, but we can't keep it. No one could keep it perfectly. Paul, in turning from his trust in the law and putting his trust in Christ, actually died and rose again in Christ. This means that the law's demands for death have been met because Paul died in Jesus. And now Paul, in Christ, is living a new life. He's living in new creation. Now, this is true for everyone who has trusted in Jesus Christ. And this is what we call positional righteousness. Someone who has placed their trust in Jesus Christ as having kept the law perfectly on their behalf, having died and having rose again, those people are declared righteous because we are in Christ. We died and rose again in him. You can read all about it in a bit more detail in Romans 6 to 7. So to stress, if you have trusted in Christ, then you are declared righteous in the sight of God. Question 4 was about the law and righteousness by the law. If we could be declared righteous by obedience to the law, then God's grace and the agonizing death of Christ was completely unnecessary. Now, it's good to know that later at the Jerusalem Council, Peter did stand up for Gentile Christians. And you can read about it in Acts 15, verse 1 to 11. So to summarize this whole section, the biographical argument, Paul received the pure gospel from the mouth of Christ, not from man. He received his apostleship from God the Father, not from man. When he finally did go down to talk to the other apostles about his ministry after a long time, they recognized that he was called by God to be an apostle to the Gentiles. And finally, far from him twisting the true gospel he received from the apostles, it was actually Paul that corrected Peter for beginning to move away from it with his actions. So the accusations that the Judaizers made are completely false, and that's what Paul's defending in the biographical argument. So here we are in chapter 3, verse 1 to 5. Again, we are in the theological argument now, and Paul is going to show from the Old Testament that righteousness is by faith and not by the law. So 3 questions. Question 1, how did the Galatian believers receive the Spirit? Chapter 3, verse 1 to 2 and verse 5. Question 2, What have they begun to believe about how to mature and grow as a Christian? Chapter 3, verse 3. And in question 3, what and why did these Galatian believers suffer? Chapter 3, verse 4, and also go and read chapter 5, verse 11, and chapter 6, verse 12. God bless.